am Thomas Westbrook here of Holy Kool-Aid. You're watching Atheist Edge. Congratulations to you guys on hitting 1 year of putting out steady, amazing content. If you guys are watching this, like, subscribe, share it around. Let's see them get to 100,000 by year 2.
If we begin from a position of philosophical naturalism, the presumption that nothing supernatural is possible, we have no choice but to describe the supernatural elements we find in the gospel as lies. From a naturalistic perspective, prophetic claims are impossible. Wallace, this is such a double standard. When you see a prophet from the modern day, or people claiming to be prophets anyway, of course you are going to demand evidence of these supernatural claims. The fact of the matter is that is reasonable, but you want us to presuppose that these things are even possible for a person who lived thousands of years ago whose evidence for existence is fleeting. You wouldn't hold yourself to that standard for a modern day prophet, say one from Mormonism, but you want us to do it for your prophet that you've deemed a reasonable story. Also, many of us did not start out from the position of philosophical naturalism. I myself was very religious and thought supernatural miracles were absolutely plausible. It wasn't until later that I realized that there is no reason to assume that the supernatural is possible, which to me is completely different than saying it is impossible. You give me a good reason, and I'll start to entertain the possibility. But the fact is, as of present, there is no good reason.
But Wallace, you don't take all prophecy claims at face value, right? You don't just assume people are prophets unless you're shown otherwise. And yet you want us to start from the standpoint that Jesus is in fact a true prophet, and hinge your dating of the Gospels on the idea that he predicted the fall of the temple, not the far more reasonable proposition that this prophecy was written after the temple's destruction. I mean, he claims to be a skeptic himself, and yet he's basing this whole dating on the least skeptical position imaginable.
You know why a razor blade is our logo, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why?
Cutting through the bullshit?
Oh, that's good too. It works on like 6 levels.
It's got levels.
Oh, it's got like 6 levels. We're edgy sometimes, and I've heard of so many, I've heard of 6 good explanations why a razor blade is our logo, but it's Occam's razor. That was the original intention. Yeah. So really, exactly, I mean, what is the most reasonable, what is the simplest explanation for this? Come on.
Well, he talks about what's reasonable, what's reasonable, what's reasonable.
Yes, beyond a reasonable doubt, using, your logic and your reason. What is the most reasonable?
It also assumes that the gospel accounts are false until proved true. This is just the opposite approach we take with witness testimony when it's presented in court. Okay, I have to stop for a second because that's upsetting to me, because you don't just assume that a witness is telling the truth. You just don't. There's a lot of other factors to take into account before you decide that what somebody is saying is true. We ought to presume that witnesses are telling the truth until we discover otherwise. And the presence of the miraculous alone should not cause us to believe that the gospel eyewitnesses were lying. Okay, honestly, this guy was an investigator. An investigator. In order for this logic to track, it would be reasonable to say that unless we have explicit information to the contrary, we shouldn't have justification to question anything that anybody says ever. It also proposes that lying is the only option. Someone could be mistaken or misunderstand or be convinced without lying. Memories are highly fallible to a well-known and established degree, and humans themselves are suggestible and prone to a myriad of cognitive and perceptual errors that make our accounts unreliable. This is well-known, researched, and documented information, and I'm floored by this right now.
Yes, this is exactly what you should be doing. Remember what Wallace said earlier? He says, I'm going to quote here, "Jurors have a duty to take an unbiased look at witnesses and assume the best in them unless they have a reason to do otherwise." So if you have a witness that says that they saw fairies, aliens, Santa Claus, Sasquatches, ghosts, or chupacabras, you now have a reason to do otherwise. But when you have witnesses who says that their dead rabbi came to life, we're just supposed to take them at their word for it? What are the standards here?
Yep, exactly. He says gospel eyewitnesses throughout this entire book. Ask my wife how many times I just out of the blue, and it scared her sometimes. I would jump up, objection, Your Honor, speculation, objection, Your Honor, badgering the witness, right? Mm-hmm. But at least a dozen times I would stand up and say, objection, Your Honor, hearsay. Hearsay, hearsay, hearsay. If I went back and read this book with the presupposition that the eyewitnesses were indeed first-hand eyewitnesses, I would read this book completely different. And I would agree with him on almost everything in this book. This is the crucial part of this. It seems like Wallace, and it's a fringe outlying, it's a fringe position, even in sectarian circles.
I think a lot of people just haven't thought about it. They haven't even considered the possibility that maybe the Gospel of Matthew wasn't actually written by Matthew. I know that there are Christians who acknowledge the anonymous authorship, still believe it, but they acknowledge the scholarship. But it's just, you're not going to find secular scholars who take the authorship at face value.
If we could be sure that there was at least one, maybe half a dozen, let's say half a dozen, true eyewitnesses that put pen to paper and actually wrote what we're reading, would that change how you read this book? Would that have changed how you perceive this book? Does that do anything?
I think it would give me a higher percentage of confidence in it. Right now that percentage is pretty low, but if I don't know if it would get me all the way to belief, but it would lend more credibility to the narrative than we have right now. We still have to get over the issue of, okay, magic isn't real, and we have an instance where supposedly magic happened. That's probably a bigger hurdle for me to cover than whether an eyewitness says magic happened or whether second, third person says magic happened. But yeah, having an actual confirmed eyewitness document would be a point in the believer's favor.
No evil will befall you means that evil dreams and evil thoughts will not tempt you, nor shall any plague come near your house means that you will not have a son or a disciple who burns his food like Jesus of Nazareth. It was taught, on the day before the Passover they hanged Jesus. A herald went before him for 40 days, proclaiming, he will be stoned because he practiced magic and enticed Israel to go astray. Let anyone who knows anything in his favor come forward and plead for him. But nothing was found in his favor, and they hanged him on the day before the Passover. These are ancient Jewish writings that Wallace quotes as corroboration outside the Gospel accounts. There are a few things, though, that I think you guys will be able to catch on to. For one, most of these events are not actually in the Gospels. I don't remember Jesus getting a 40-day reprieve while they searched for a character witness, and nowhere in the Gospel does it mention that Jesus ever burned his food. Not to mention, Jesus wasn't hanged, he was crucified. Now, I'm sure there are a bit of semantics you can get into on what it actually meant to be hanged during that time. While hanging from the cross is definitely different than the gallows that we would consider today, a case may be made that that's what they actually meant. A case can also be meant for Jesus burning his food, given that there are at least 20 years of Jesus' life that we don't have any documentation of within the Gospels. It's very easy to assume that the burning of food might have been one of the things that happened during that time that was not documented in the Bible. But that's the problem, though, is that you have to start assuming things. And if you're assuming things instead of making logical inferences, you stop having a good case. Also, at best, if we took these ancient Jewish writings as corroboration with the gospel, they would give us that Jesus was a man who died on a cross, if we grant the very loose definition of hanged. Once we've done so, at best we're left with a dead man on a tree who was the founder of a religion. If that's all the evidence that you need to make your case, then I think that Jonestown and Heaven's Gate have much stronger cases to make. We don't have an age-long debate over whether or not the religious founders of those particular sects actually existed, the founders all died for their cause in one form or another, as did many disciples of both causes. What makes those more modern beliefs any less believable than the beliefs of Christianity? If it is, at best, the amount of people that espouse Christianity, that's just telling me the amount of people that believe the ridiculous thing, not why they believe it.
Now, these are ancient Jewish writings that Wallace quotes as, because he wants, outside corroboration of the Gospels. He doesn't just want the Gospels being the only evidence for Jesus. But these don't sound like the Gospel narratives of Jesus. I mean, when did Jesus burn his food? When the Gospels did Jesus get a 40-day reprieve while heralds went around looking for character witnesses? That doesn't match up with the Gospels at all, and yet he's pointed to this as corroboration of the Gospels. How does that work?
Yeah, I missed this part in the book.
Yeah, I really don't know what Wallace thinks he's gaining by including these. He didn't have to include these. In fact, I would have left them out. They just raise way more questions than they answer.
Is it a criterion of embarrassment a little? Like the fig tree, for instance? It's the first one that comes to mind.
That's a little bit different. 'Cause, I mean, the fig tree instance is like, why would they include Jesus losing his temper? That makes Jesus look bad.
Yeah.
This is
burning the food.
Yeah, this is giving, because Jesus did not spend 40 days in jail before he got crucified. It was very bam, bam, bam. He got. If anything, the
trial was the next day after the garden, right?
If anything, they railroaded him through the whole process.
In fact, the way it reads, like when he was praying in the garden, that was the night before his arrest.
They dragged the Sanhedrin up like in the middle of the night to try and get this guy crucified by daybreak. If this is to believe, they had plenty of time to work with. They had 40 days. They had a guy running around, I didn't even know this was a Jewish thing that they did to try and have a herald go around. But there's nothing in the Gospels that's anywhere. It's not even compatible with the Gospel accounts.
And have you heard omniscient narrative? Mm-hmm. Omniscient narration.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm probably on a little bit of a tangent here, but so he's in the Garden of Gethsemane praying by himself, and it's being written about like someone was standing right over his shoulder. Mm-hmm. Now, the only way that could have happened is he had time to go and tell somebody later. Mm-hmm. But he gets snatched up that night, goes on trial the next day. There's always a chance for, like, I don't know, there could have been 10 minutes there where a servant, and he said, I don't know. It is possible, but that just seems this long, drawn-out narrative of Jesus and what he prayed and how he prayed, verbatim. Everything he said. And in the Bible, there was no one around. There were some people not too far away, some of his guys, but Jesus even says in the narrative that they kept falling asleep. And he went over there once and twice, I don't know, to wake them up and say, hey, stay awake. He goes off and prays, and it makes it very clear that he's alone. He's out of earshot of everybody.
Yeah, talk about John, where however you want to date it, as the last gospel written, and you have people who have apparently preserved these long monologues that he went on word for word, like he had a secretary following him around before anyone knew that he was worth following around, and it strains credibility.
Many other gospel details have been corroborated by archaeology. Such discoveries continue to validate the claims of the gospel writers from the outside in. I'm not an archaeologist, but I have heard of some claims that are made about archaeology findings that end up not being valid, or they find some piece of something that they interpret as meaning more than it does. But there are plenty of claims made in the Bible that aren't found in archaeology, like the mass exodus of Jews out of Egypt. That never happened. And we know that never happened. There are plenty of historical accounts that are made in the Bible that we haven't found. So it doesn't really matter if we find some things here and there, people that really existed or events that really happened. But there are plenty of people in the Bible and events that we know didn't happen and didn't exist. So just that mere inconsistency gives us question about this text.
So let's say that you're a homicide investigator and you get a report that a werewolf mauled a victim behind the bodega on 54th Street, right? And so you go and you confirm that, yep, there's a bodega on 54th Street. Does that lend any kind of credibility to the werewolf angle?
That is a perfect example. Yeah.
Like you've passed the barest scrutiny on that one. Now when you talk about werewolves, whether werewolves are real, whether they're possible, where this is a thing that could actually even theoretically happen before we even start taking it seriously as an explanation for these events.
Every Dickens tale is set in
It's all old Victorian
Victorian London usually, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, the Christmas Carol. So that means there are ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future, right? Mm-hmm. Same deal.
Well, shoot, Forrest Gump has him interacting with all these presidents and all these historical events, and he invented the smiley face and the shit happens bumper sticker, and we know all those things are real, so Forrest Gump was a real person.
There's some very important gospel details that not only are not corroborated by archaeology, they're impossible by natural standards. The sun went dark. I call that an eclipse, but I've heard believers try to rationalize that away. Oh, it just says the sun went dark, doesn't say an eclipse. Okay.
So what does that mean?
Right.
Like it got cloudy for a half hour?
And why even mention it if it was just an overcast day for 3 hours? Yeah. You know.
And then 12 hours later, the sky went dark. Well, that's called nighttime, fuckers. It's just not a sign of anything.
The curtain of the temple ripped. All right. We just automatically, it tore us under, and earthquake. And I'm not going to mention the zombies. I do every show, but the dead saints that crawl out of the ground. These are gospel details. They're big, and they're not corroborated, and they can't be explained by natural standards. And the only people I ever hear bring up all the events that occurred post-resurrection are non-believers. You never hear a believer bring it up themselves. If they were truly after the truth, they'd be the first to bring it up. Why do they leave it to us to always bring them up? There's a good solid dozen events that happened immediately post-resurrection that never get talked about by anyone except non-believers.
I don't think anyone's ever brought up the zombie thing in church. Ever. Not the entire time I've ever been to church.
Yeah.
I think they probably read the gospel, read the post-resurrection accounts on Easter, and they just don't even address it. Like, we don't dress up. I think people should dress up as zombies on Easter in remembrance of all the undead that rose in the most miraculous mass rising.
That's a good way to get kicked out of Bible study, probably.
That's what I'll do next. If I haven't been to church on Easter recently, nor do I intend to, but if I'm ever dragged along a church for whatever reason, I'll tuck that away.
You see memes that Jesus was the zombie Jew savior or whatever, and then I saw a list of why he could not be a zombie, because zombies are mindless, and then he couldn't be a ghast or a white either, because they are intelligent but they're incorporeal, and it lists all the different types of undead. And so it turns out the best explanation of what Jesus was a lich. A lich is in his time on earth as a mortal, he was a wielder of magic, and then when he died, he used his magic to keep himself alive. So he has intelligence, he has a corporeal body. So he's a lich.
As a bonus, if you tweet a picture of yourself in a zombie costume at church to @AtheistEdge, we'll, give you 50% off your next video you watch. I don't know. I should really put Jim on the spot there.
But I'm done. I'm sorry. Holy smokes. I didn't think this one was going to make me as mad as the last one, but apparently it's making me as mad as the last one. Okay.